It can't be her. She's supposed to be dead. Those were the judge's words when I walked into my father's federal trial as the prosecution's star witness. The entire courtroom froze. Lawyers, jury members, even the bailiffs stopped mid-movement. That afternoon, alone in my hotel room, I held a silver locket I'd carried for 5 years, the only piece of my old life I kept when I became Rebecca Miller, a woman who didn't exist. Inside was my mother's photo, the same photo that appeared in my obituary 5 years ago. My father, William Harper, had no idea that his dead daughter had spent half a decade collecting every piece of evidence that would bring down his empire. My name is Rebecca, and this is the story of how a courtroom resurrection changed everything. Before I tell you how a faked death and a mother's locket taught my father that some truths refuse to stay buried, subscribe and share this story with someone who knows what it's like to disappear to survive. And please, comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with survivors from all over the world. What happened in that courtroom taught us that sometimes staying silent keeps us safe, but speaking the truth sets us free. How did I become a ghost? Standing in the marble corridor of the Allegheny County Federal Building, that question wasn't philosophical anymore. It was architectural, tactical, bureaucratic. 5 years ago, Rebecca Harper had drowned in Lake Erie during a sailing accident. The Coast Guard found her boat capsized, personal belongings scattered across the water, one shoe floating near the shore. Local newspapers ran the story for 3 days. My father gave a tearful interview about losing his only daughter. There was a funeral with a closed casket and white roses everywhere. But Rebecca Miller, the woman I'd become, had watched that funeral from across the cemetery with binoculars, standing behind an oak tree, wearing a wig and sunglasses like some amateur spy. The woman standing here now, outside courtroom 3B, existed in a strange liminal space between those two identities. My real social security number was attached to a death certificate. My current driver's license belonged to someone the government had carefully constructed, employment history, rental agreements, bank accounts, all meticulously fabricated by the Witness Protection Program. For 5 years I'd answered to a different name, celebrated a different birthday, pretended my mother had been a schoolteacher from Idaho instead of the brilliant attorney she actually was. The corridor stretched long and empty ahead of me, afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked downtown Pittsburgh. Dust particles floated in those beams of light, and I found myself thinking about evidence, how the smallest invisible things become visible under the right illumination, how what seems like empty air actually contains everything you need to build a case. Through the small rectangular window in the courtroom door, I watched the theater of justice playing out. My father sat ramrod straight, whispering something to his lead attorney, Marcus Chun, the man who'd made a career defending white-collar criminals with faces in Forbes magazine. The jury box held 12 people who looked exhausted. This trial had been going on for 6 weeks already, countless witnesses describing shell companies and offshore accounts and wire transfers that zigzagged across continents. They probably thought they'd heard everything. They had no idea that the prosecution's final witness was supposed to be rotting at the bottom of Lake Erie. The locket felt heavy against my sternum, a piece of antique silver that had belonged to my mother. Inside it, her photograph smiled at me the way she used to before everything changed, before she started leaving cryptic notes in books, before she began recording conversations, before her car went off that bridge and whether that wasn't actually that bad. I'd spent 3 years thinking her death was exactly what it appeared to be, a tragic accident. Then I'd spent 2 years learning it was murder dressed up as misfortune. The locket hadn't just been jewelry. She'd hidden a micro SD card behind her photograph, so small I'd missed it for a decade. That card contained passwords, account numbers, meeting recordings. Everything. My mother had been building a case against my father from inside their marriage, and she'd left me the blueprint for finishing what she'd started. Federal prosecutor Diana Reeves had found me 8 months ago, tracked Rebecca Miller to her apartment in Cleveland where I had been working as a paralegal under my assumed name. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even in my constructed life, I couldn't escape the law. She'd knocked on my door at 7 a.m, shown me her credentials, and said 6 words that shattered my carefully built fortress of anonymity. Rebecca Harper. "We know you're alive." I'd almost slammed the door in her face. Almost ran. Almost disappeared again into whatever new identity I could cobble together. But Diana had brought photographs, crime scene analysis of my mother's accident, financial records that proved my father had been stealing from his clients for 30 years, testimony from people I'd known growing up who'd mysteriously disappeared or died in convenient ways. She'd laid it all out on my kitchen table while my coffee went cold, and when she finished, she'd asked me one question. How long do you want to keep being dead? The bailiff stationed inside caught my eye through the window and gave me a slight nod. John Mitchum, former Marine, 20 years in court security, and according to Diana, the only person in that building besides the judge who knew what was about to happen. Protocol required it. You can't have a dead woman walk into a federal trial without security briefed on the situation. We'd gone over contingencies. What if my father tried to run? What if he became violent? What if his legal team immediately moved for a mistrial? Diana had been adamant that the theatrical reveal was necessary because, in her words, your father has been controlling narratives his entire life. Time for reality to punch him in the face. She'd actually said that, sitting in a Starbucks 3 blocks from here last Tuesday while we did our final preparation. I'd laughed then, a bitter sound that didn't quite feel like my own voice anymore. My fingers wrapped around the door handle, brass worn smooth by thousands of hands seeking justice or mercy or simply closure. The metal was cold despite the warm building, and I thought about all the people who'd touched this same handle before me, defendants about to hear their fate, witnesses about to betray friends, lawyers about to make closing arguments that would define careers. I wondered if any of them had been dead before walking through. The hinges would squeak. Diana had warned me about that, said it would draw immediate attention, that I should own the entrance rather than trying to slip in quietly. You're not sneaking back into life, Rebecca. You're reclaiming it. That distinction mattered more than I'd expected. I pressed down on the handle, felt the latch release with a soft mechanical click, and pushed. The door swung inward with that telltale squeak, high-pitched and sustained, like a movie director had planned it for maximum dramatic effect. The courtroom smell hit me first. Leather from the chairs, floor wax, the faint acidic scent of coffee from the court reporter's thermos. Then the temperature change, cooler inside from aggressive air conditioning. Then the sound of my heels on hardwood, 3 steps before anyone even fully turned around. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, her mouth still forming a word that would never be completed. A juror in the front row leaned forward, squinting like maybe she was imagining things. One of my father's attorneys actually dropped his pen, and it clattered against the defense table with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Judge Morrison's reaction was what broke me inside while keeping my face perfectly composed. His hand froze halfway to his gavel, suspended in air like time had stopped working properly. His eyes went wide behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his lips formed my name. Not Rebecca Miller, but Rebecca Harper, the name he'd known since I was 7 years old when my mother brought me to his chambers during a case conference. He'd given me a butterscotch candy from a jar on his desk. "Rebecca," he whispered, and the courtroom microphone caught it, amplified it, made it echo off the mahogany walls. "It can't be." My father turned last, moving with the careful precision of someone who knows what's behind them will be terrible but can't stop themselves from looking. Our eyes met across 30 feet of expensive carpet and institutional furniture, across 5 years of my supposed death, across 29 years of his lies, and I watched his face do something I'd never seen before, completely collapse. Not anger, not shock exactly, but a kind of existential horror, like watching the laws of physics reverse themselves. The prosecutor's voice cut through the frozen tableau with perfect prosecutorial timing, professional and clear despite the chaos she'd just unleashed. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls its final witness, Rebecca Harper." Before I became a ghost, before I learned what my father really was, I'd been the kind of daughter who believed her dad hung the moon and personally arranged the stars for her convenience. The Harper estate sat on 47 acres in Sewickley Heights, Pennsylvania's answer to old money trying to pretend it wasn't new money, where William Harper had built his reputation as the investment advisor to Pittsburgh's elite. Our house wasn't just a home, it was a statement rendered in limestone and leaded glass, with a circular driveway that could accommodate 12 cars during the charity galas my father hosted quarterly, a library with floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves that held first editions he'd never read, and a dining room where crystal chandeliers from Austria cast prismatic light across mahogany tables that sat 24 people comfortably. I'd grown up thinking this was normal, that everyone's father had a home office with 3 separate phone lines and a safe hidden behind a Remington painting, that every little girl got to wear Dior dresses to middle school graduation, that private planes to Martha's Vineyard for summer weekends were just how families operated. My childhood memories were soaked in privilege I didn't recognize as privilege because I had nothing to compare it against. Horseback riding lessons with an Olympic trainer who came to our private stables twice weekly, piano instruction from a Juilliard professor who made the trip from New York every Friday, French tutors and tennis coaches, and that one summer when my father hired a professional astronomer to set up a telescope in our garden because I'd mentioned liking stars. He'd been that kind of father, the kind who made grand gestures look effortless, who could make you feel like the center of the universe with nothing more than his attention. I remember being 8 years old, sitting in his office after school while he worked, spinning in his leather chair and pretending to be a businesswoman, and he'd look up from his computer and say, "That's my girl, already preparing to take over the empire." Empire. He'd used that word even then, and I'd felt so proud, so special, like I was a princess in a kingdom where money solved every problem and success was measured in square footage and stock portfolios. Every Sunday, we'd have breakfast together in the conservatory, just the 2 of us after my mother stopped joining us when I was around 10, and he'd tell me stories about deals he closed, clients he'd impressed, investments that had paid off spectacularly. "The key to success, Rebecca," he'd say while spreading imported marmalade on toast that cost more per jar than most people spent on a week's groceries, "is understanding that the world runs on trust, and trust is just another commodity you can trade." I'd nod like I understood, sipping fresh squeezed orange juice from Waterford crystal glasses, watching morning light filter through exotic orchids that a gardener maintained full-time. The mansion had 17 rooms, and my favorite was my mother's private sitting area on the 2nd floor, a space she decorated with family photographs and soft furniture that felt like it belonged to a different house entirely. She'd read there in the afternoons, legal briefs mostly. She'd been a corporate attorney before marrying my father, brilliant by all accounts, and she'd maintained her practice until I was born. After that, she'd become what wealthy wives became, a fixture at charity events, a name on museum donor walls, a perfectly styled presence at dinner parties where her job was to make everyone comfortable while never being interesting enough to outshine her husband. I used to curl up on the couch next to her, doing homework while she read case law, and sometimes she'd look up and say things that didn't make sense to me then. "Rebecca, sweetheart, remember that just because something looks beautiful doesn't mean it's good." Or, "Your father loves you very much, but love doesn't always mean the same thing to different people." Or once, when I was 13 and complaining about a friend who betrayed me, "Some people are very good at showing you exactly what you want to see." I thought she was being philosophical, offering maternal wisdom in that vague way adults did. Now I understand she was trying to warn me, planting seeds of doubt that she hoped would grow into questions before it was too late. The house hosted legendary parties. I'd watch from the upstairs landing as Pittsburgh's powerful mingled below, senators and CEOs and cultural elite drinking champagne that cost more than most cars, their laughter echoing off marble floors that had been imported from Italy. My father would move through those crowds like royalty, shaking hands and making deals and creating the impression that his success was inevitable, natural, the simple result of hard work and American ingenuity. I'd felt so proud watching him, this magnetic figure who commanded respect, who made people laugh and convinced them to trust him with their money, their futures, their children's inheritance. But there were moments, small fractures in the perfect facade that I dismissed as childish misunderstanding. Like the time I was 14 and walked into his office unannounced, something I'd done hundreds of times before, and found him shredding documents at 11 o'clock at night, his face twisted with stress I'd never seen before, and when he noticed me, his expression shifted so fast it was like watching a mask slide into place. "Just cleaning up, princess," he'd said, but his hands were shaking. Or the weekend my mother had bruises on her arm that she claimed came from gardening, but I'd seen my father's face during that explanation, the way his jaw clenched, the warning look he'd given her. Or the business partner, Richard Morrison, no relation to the judge, who'd been my father's closest friend, who taught me to play chess and always remembered my birthday, who disappeared from our lives when I was 16, and when I'd asked where Uncle Richard went, my father had said simply, he made some bad choices and had to leave town, in a voice that ended the conversation permanently. I'd been trained not to ask questions, not explicitly, but through 1,000 small corrections, a pattern of conversations shut down, topics redirected, curiosity discouraged with just enough charm that I didn't realize I was being controlled. "You don't need to worry about boring business things, Rebecca," my father would say whenever I asked about his work. "Your job is to be brilliant and beautiful and make your old man proud." And I believed him, believed that my value came from being his perfect daughter, from reflecting his success, from never digging beneath the surface of our beautiful life. Did she really have an accident? That question haunted me for 3 years before I finally admitted the answer was no, but when Katherine Harper's Mercedes went through the guardrail on Route 65 during a December rainstorm, the official explanation seemed painfully plausible: wet roads, a dangerous curve, a tragic moment of lost control that ended with her car submerged in the Ohio River. I was 19, home from Yale for winter break, and I got the call at 2 in the morning from a police officer whose voice was professionally sympathetic in that way that meant he'd delivered this news before. "There's been an accident involving your mother," he'd said, and those 6 words had shattered everything, though not in the way I'd understood at the time. The funeral happened 4 days later, a spectacle of grief rendered in white roses and expensive caskets, and a church so full of Pittsburgh's elite that people had to stand in the back. My father had worn a black suit and held my hand during the service, and I'd watched him cry, actual tears streaming down his face, while the minister talked about Catherine's charity work and her brilliant legal mind and her devotion to family. He'd seemed destroyed, hollowed out, a man who'd lost his anchor. Everyone commented on how strong he was being for me, how admirably he was handling his devastation, how clear it was that he truly loved his wife. The viewing line stretched for 2 hours, business associates and country club friends and distant relatives all offering condolences that sounded the same after a while. "She was such a wonderful woman. What a terrible tragedy. If there's anything we can do." My father had stood beside me accepting sympathies like he was accepting awards, gracious and composed, occasionally breaking down just enough to seem genuine without being unseemly. I'd been too numb to notice the performance, too wrapped up in my own grief to see how perfectly orchestrated everything was. The police investigation lasted exactly 3 days before ruling it an accidental death, standard procedure for single-vehicle crashes with no witnesses, the detective had explained, showing me photographs I wish I'd never seen. Skid marks on wet pavement, twisted metal guardrail, recovery efforts that took 14 hours because the current was strong and the visibility poor. "Your mother wasn't wearing her seatbelt," he'd said gently, like this explained everything. Like this one detail made her death inevitable rather than preventable. Sometimes in moments of panic, people forget, or it jams, or they're distracted. The rain was heavy that night. Visibility was less than 100 feet. These curves are dangerous, even in good conditions. He'd handed me a report that was only 7 pages long. A life reduced to police codes and witness statements from the truck driver who'd called 911 after seeing taillights disappear over the edge, and measurements of stopping distance and blood alcohol content. 0. She'd been completely sober, and a final conclusion that used words like accidental and weather-related and no suspicious circumstances. My father had thanked the detective, shaken his hand, closed the case with the same efficiency he closed business deals. "We need to move forward, Rebecca," he told me that night, sitting in the library where my mother used to read, his hand on my shoulder in what I thought was comfort. "Your mother would want us to be strong, to honor her memory by living fully. She wouldn't want us dwelling on the tragedy." Even then, some part of me had wondered why he was so eager to move past her death, why he'd packed up her sitting room within 2 weeks, why her clothes disappeared from the closet before I'd even returned to school, why he'd changed the security codes to the house and his office and installed new locks I didn't have keys for. The weather that night had been bad. Everyone agreed on that. December rain in Pennsylvania, temperatures hovering just above freezing, roads slick but not icy. But my mother had driven in worse conditions hundreds of times, had lived in Pittsburgh her entire adult life, knew every dangerous curve and treacherous intersection. She'd been a cautious driver, almost obsessively so, The kind of person who checked her mirrors 3 times before changing lanes and refused to drive if she'd had even a single glass of wine. The idea that she'd somehow lost control on a road she'd traveled weekly seemed wrong, but grief does strange things to logic, makes you accept explanations because the alternative, that something darker happened, is too horrible to consider. Her car had been totaled, crushed, and waterlogged beyond any useful forensic examination, or so the insurance company had claimed when they'd pushed through the settlement with unusual speed. My father had handled all of that, signed papers, and made decisions while I was back at school trying to focus on finals, trying to pretend my world hadn't collapsed. When I'd come home for spring break, the car was already gone, disposed of through some salvage process I never fully understood, and when I'd asked about it, my father had looked at me with what seemed like genuine pain. "Why would you want to see that, sweetheart? Why torture yourself with a machine that killed her?" And I'd felt ashamed for asking, guilty for wanting details, like I was being morbid instead of thorough. But small things nagged at me, details that didn't quite align with the neat narrative of tragic accident. Like the fact that my mother had told me 3 days before her death that she needed to show me something important, something about my father's business that I needed to understand before it was too late. She'd been agitated during that phone call, speaking quickly, and when I'd asked what she meant, she'd said, "Not over the phone, Rebecca. When you're home for break, we'll talk in person. I've been documenting everything." Documenting what? I'd been annoyed at the drama, rolled my eyes at what I'd thought was marital tension spilling over into my relationship with her. I told her I was busy with papers and maybe we could talk after Christmas, and she'd gone quiet for a long moment before saying, "Please be careful, sweetheart, and remember that I love you more than anything in this world." 3 days later she was gone, and that conversation haunted me, those words, documenting everything, echoing in my head during sleepless nights. Or the fact that her best friend, Linda Morrison, the judge's wife, had called me 2 weeks after the funeral, asking if my mother had left me anything unusual, any papers or files or personal effects. "We'd been having lunch once a week," Linda had said, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear. She'd mentioned working on a project, something important. I just wondered if she'd finished it. When I told my father about the call, he'd been dismissive. "Linda's grieving, looking for meaning where there isn't any. Your mother wasn't working on anything except her garden and her book club." But he changed the subject quickly, and later that week, Linda had stopped calling, stopped reaching out, and when I'd run into her at a charity event months later, she barely made eye contact, claimed she was too busy to catch up, practically fled the conversation like I was contagious with something dangerous. Graduating from Yale with a degree in economics felt like fulfilling destiny rather than making a choice, and when my father offered me a position at Harper Investment Group 6 months after my mother's death, I'd accepted with something close to relief. Grief had made school feel hollow, and the idea of working alongside him, of learning the empire he'd built, felt like honoring both my parents' memory and my own ambition. "You're a natural, just like your mother was," he'd said during my first week, showing me to an office on the 3rd floor of the downtown Pittsburgh building that bore our family name in bronze letters above the entrance. And I'd felt that familiar swell of pride mixed with the ache of loss because my mother had never gotten to see me step into this world she'd once inhabited. The Harper Investment Group occupied 4 floors of a glass and steel tower with views of the 3 rivers, employing 67 people who managed portfolios worth over $2 billion, and my official title was Junior Investment Analyst, which meant I spent my days reviewing client accounts, preparing reports, attending meetings where men in expensive suits discussed risk management and diversification strategies. The office smelled like expensive coffee and printer toner and the particular blend of cologne and ambition that seemed to permeate every financial firm. And I'd loved it initially, loved feeling like I was part of something significant, like I was finally understanding the mysterious work that had consumed my father's life and funded my privileged existence. He'd been generous with access, giving me login credentials to client databases, including me in strategy sessions, explaining complex financial instruments over lunch at the private club where deals happened over ribeye steaks, and scotch that cost more per ounce than most people earn per hour. "I'm grooming you to take over eventually," he told me during my 3rd month, and I'd felt chosen, special, like I was being invited into an exclusive club where success was measured in percentage points and market timing. But the access he'd given me was also access to things he hadn't intended me to see, patterns that emerged when you spent late nights reviewing files, inconsistencies that became visible when you looked at accounts over years instead of quarters. It started small, almost innocuous. A client named Sarah Brennan whose quarterly statements showed steady growth, but whose actual trade history revealed something stranger. Her account would lose money consistently in specific stocks, while another account under a different name would profit from those same positions at nearly identical times. The correlation was too perfect to be coincidence, too consistent to be market timing, and when I'd pulled the other account, registered to a shell company in Delaware, I'd found my father's signature on the formation documents. I'd stared at those papers for 20 minutes in my office at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, my desk lamp creating a small circle of light in the otherwise dark floor, trying to find an innocent explanation for why my father would be trading against his own clients' interests. Maybe it was a hedge, some sophisticated strategy one didn't understand yet. Maybe there were disclosures I hadn't found. Maybe this was normal in ways my textbook education hadn't covered. I told myself these things while photocopying the documents, while creating a folder on my personal laptop labeled Questions for Dad, while starting what would become a collection of financial irregularities that I initially believed had innocent explanations. The copying machine had made rhythmic sounds in the quiet office, and I'd felt simultaneously guilty for investigating my own father and responsible for being thorough, two impulses that would define the next 3 years of my life. The deeper I looked, the more the pattern revealed itself. Dozens of clients whose accounts showed losses while corresponding offshore entities showed gains, a systematic transfer of wealth so carefully structured that it looked like bad luck rather than theft. My father wasn't just skimming fees or charging hidden costs. He was actively trading against his clients' interests, using their capital to fund positions that benefited shadow companies he controlled, timing transactions to extract maximum value while maintaining plausible deniability. It was sophisticated, brilliant even in its construction, and it had been happening for at least 20 years based on the oldest documents I could access. 20 years of stealing from people who trusted him, from friends and business associates, and elderly widows who'd given him control of their retirement savings. Some of these clients I'd met at dinner parties, had served champagne to during charity events, had watched my father embrace while promising to take good care of your family's future. The cognitive dissonance was brutal. How could the father who taught me to ride a bike and paid for my education and held me while I cried about my mother also be systematically defrauding vulnerable people? I'd started keeping two versions of my father in my head, the public William Harper who was charismatic and successful and beloved, and the private one whose files revealed a predator in expensive suits. Every morning I'd arrive at the office and watch him greet employees warmly, ask about their children, remember birthdays and anniversaries, perform kindness like it was just another business strategy. Every evening I'd stay late reviewing documents that proved those performances were calculated manipulations, pieces of a long con that had netted him hundreds of millions in ill-gotten wealth. 3 months into my investigation, though I wasn't calling it that yet, still wasn't admitting what I was really doing, I'd found my mother's name in the archives. Catherine Harper had been listed as a partner in the firm's early years, before I was born, and her signature appeared on formation documents and client agreements and regulatory filings. But there was something else. A series of memos she'd written to my father, professionally worded concerns about accounting discrepancies and unusual trade patterns and potential regulatory exposure. The memos had gotten progressively more direct over the span of 18 months, her legal training evident in the careful documentation, the precise language that stopped just short of accusing him of crimes while making clear she knew exactly what was happening. The final memo, dated 6 months before my birth, had been blunt. William, I reviewed the Cayman accounts and the client matching transactions. This constitutes fraud. We need to discuss remediation immediately, or I'll be forced to report to the SEC. There was no record of his response, but the next document in the file was her resignation as partner, a brief letter that cited personal reasons and a desire to focus on family. I'd sat in the archives room, a climate-controlled space in the basement that smelled like old paper and preservation chemicals, holding that memo with shaking hands, finally understanding that my mother hadn't just suspected my father was a criminal. She'd known. She documented it. She tried to stop him. And then she'd retired, to become a housewife, giving up her legal career, her partnership, her independence. I'd always been told she'd wanted to stay home with me, that it was her choice, her preference. Now I understood it had been a deal, probably brokered with threats. Stay quiet and keep your comfortable life, or expose me and lose everything. She'd chosen silence, at least initially, but the memos proved she'd never stopped watching, never stopped knowing. I was becoming exactly what she'd been, the daughter inside the criminal enterprise, collecting evidence, understanding the scope of the betrayal, trapped between loyalty and truth. Breaking into your father's private office while he's at a charity gala feels different than you'd imagine. Less like a spy movie, and more like a betrayal of muscle memory, your hand hovering over the biometric scanner you've watched him use 1,000 times, knowing that he'd added your fingerprint to the system 2 years ago as a gesture of trust that you were now violating. The Harper building was empty at 11 on a Saturday night, cleaning crew gone by 9, security guard making rounds every 45 minutes, which gave me a window that felt simultaneously enormous and impossibly small. My father's executive suite occupied the entire top floor, corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, conference room, private bathroom, and that inner sanctum he'd always called his thinking room. A windowless space where he took important calls and worked on sensitive matters that required absolute privacy. I'd been planning this for 2 weeks, ever since finding my mother's memos, watching his schedule, noting his patterns, waiting for an event that would keep him occupied for hours. The Children's Hospital Gala was perfect. He was receiving an award for philanthropic giving. Ironic considering the money he was donating had been stolen from the very people attending the event. He'd be there until at least midnight, probably later, schmoozing with Pittsburgh's elite, playing the role of benevolent businessman while I rifled through evidence of his crimes. The biometric scanner beeped softly, green light confirming my access, and the heavy door clicked open with a pneumatic hiss that seemed thunderous in the silent building. His office smelled exactly like I remembered from childhood visits. Leather and expensive wood polish, and that specific cologne he wore, Creed Aventus, which cost $300 a bottle, and now made my stomach turn because I couldn't separate the scent from the man. Couldn't smell it without thinking about fraud and manipulation and possible murder. The city lights provided enough illumination that I didn't need to turn on the overhead fixtures, just enough glow to navigate between furniture, to see the Remington painting on the wall that hid the safe I wasn't supposed to know about. I discovered it accidentally when I was 16, watching through the cracked door while he opened it late one night, had memorized the painting's title, The Scout, and wondered what required that level of security. Now I stood in front of it, hands sweating despite the air conditioning, trying to remember the combination I'd seen him enter exactly twice. Once when I was 16, once last month when I'd manufactured an excuse to bring him documents after hours and watched through the reflection in the window. Numbers had always been easy for me, patterns and sequences sticking in my memory like songs, and I repeated this combination to myself every night for 4 weeks. 18-33-09-44. My birthday, my mother's birthday. He'd built his security around the people he was betraying. The safe opened with a mechanical chunk that sounded catastrophically loud, and I'd frozen for 30 seconds, listening for footsteps or voices or any indication that someone had heard, but the building remained silent except for the ambient hum of HVAC systems and distant traffic. Inside the safe, illuminated by the small LED light that activated automatically, were stacks of documents in manila folders, several external hard drives, a handgun I didn't want to think about, and a leather-bound ledger that looked like something from another century. The ledger came out first, heavy and expensive, pages filled with handwritten entries in my father's precise script, dates, amounts, account numbers, names I recognized and names I didn't, a manual record of every fraudulent transaction spanning back to 1987. He'd been keeping a confession, documenting his own crimes with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to legitimate business, and as I flipped through pages, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice, I understood this wasn't just evidence of fraud. This was evidence of systematic theft from over 200 clients, totaling somewhere north of $400 million. $400 million! The number was so large it became abstract, impossible to connect to the man who'd taught me to parallel park and attended every one of my piano recitals. The clients listed included names I'd known my entire life: the Morrison family, trustees of my college fund, the Brennan widow who'd always sent me birthday cards, the Chin family whose daughter had been my middle school best friend. He'd stolen from everyone, indiscriminately, and he'd kept score like it was a game he was winning. The folders contained supporting documentation, wire transfer receipts, shell company formations, offshore account statements from Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore, jurisdictions chosen specifically for their banking secrecy and resistance to U.S. law enforcement. Each folder represented a different aspect of the scheme, one for the creation of fictitious investment losses, one for the legitimate-looking trade confirmations he'd send clients while executing different trades and shadow accounts, one for the network of lawyers and accountants who helped structure the fraud in exchange for substantial fees. There were contracts with people whose titles meant nothing: offshore compliance consultant, international tax strategist, regulatory liaison, but whose functions were clear: help hide the money, obscure the paper trail, make theft look like sophisticated financial planning. One folder made my blood run cold. Labeled simply insurance, it contained policies on key witnesses, people who'd gotten too close to the truth. 7 policies total, substantial death benefits, and next to each name a date. 3 of those dates corresponded with deaths I remembered: a former business partner who died in a home invasion that was never solved, an accountant who'd had a fatal heart attack at 39, and my mother. My mother's policy was for $5 million, dated 3 months before her accident, beneficiary listed as William Harper. He'd taken out life insurance on his wife right before she died, and I'd never known, never been told, never thought to ask, because who suspects their father of murder disguised as tragic misfortune? The external hard drives were labeled by year: 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and I'd grabbed all of them, shoving them into the messenger bag I'd brought, my hands moving faster now because the security guard's rounds were approaching and I needed to be gone before he checked this floor. But there was one more folder, tucked in the back of the safe, thinner than the others, labeled with just 2 letters: CH. Catherine Harper. My mother's initials. Inside were photocopies of the memos I'd found in the archives, but also things I hadn't seen. Photographs of her meeting with someone in a parking garage, date stamped 2 weeks before her death. Transcripts of phone conversations that must have been recorded illegally, a private investigator's report detailing her movements, her contacts, her attempts to build a case against him. The final page was a note in my father's handwriting, clinical and terrifying in its brevity. Problem requires permanent solution. Contact M for automotive solution. Arrange for bad weather window. Natural accident scenario preferred. I'd read that sentence 5 times, my brain refusing to process what it meant, what automotive solution implied, what permanent confirmed. My father hadn't just let my mother die. He planned it. He paid someone to engineer her accident, to make murder look like weather and bad luck, and he documented the order like it was just another business transaction requiring attention to detail and proper execution. Back in my apartment at 3 a.m, messenger bag full of evidence that could destroy my father sitting on my kitchen table like a bomb waiting for someone to choose detonation or defusal, I'd found myself holding the locket I'd worn every day since my mother's funeral: antique silver, oval-shaped, heavy in that way old jewelry is heavy, substantial and real in a world that suddenly felt constructed from lies. The locket had been my mother's most treasured possession, given to her by her own mother, and she'd worn it constantly, tucking it inside blouses during formal events, letting it hang visible during casual moments, touching it absent-mindedly during conversations like it was a talisman against harm that had ultimately failed to protect her. At her funeral, my father had placed it around my neck himself, his hands gentle, his voice breaking as he'd said, "She'd want you to have this, to keep her close." I'd worn it for 5 years without ever really examining it, treating it as memorial rather than message. But now, sitting in my darkened kitchen with evidence of murder and fraud spread across my counter, I'd opened it for the first time since childhood, expecting to see just my mother's photograph smiling out at me from inside the oval frame. The photo was there, her face young and hopeful from before she'd married my father, before she'd learned what kind of man he really was, but when I'd gone to close the locket, the backing hadn't sat flush, had left a tiny gap that shouldn't exist in well-crafted jewelry. My fingers, shaking from adrenaline, and fear and grief that felt fresh despite 5 years passing, had pried at the backing, expecting to find nothing but the mechanics of old metal, but instead discovering a micro SD card smaller than my thumbnail, hidden behind my mother's photograph like a secret within a secret, a message from the dead to the living that said, "I knew you'd look eventually. I knew you'd need this someday. I knew you'd become what I was trying to be." The SD card had required a special adapter to read, something I'd had to order online and wait 3 days to receive, 3 days of carrying that locket like it contained nuclear codes, 3 days of barely sleeping because every car that passed my apartment might be my father coming to retrieve what I'd stolen. 3 days of checking the news obsessively for reports of break-ins or missing documents or any indication that he discovered the violated safe. When the adapter finally arrived, I'd locked myself in my bathroom, the only room in my apartment without windows, and opened the files on my laptop with hands that could barely control the trackpad. What I found was my mother's insurance policy, her evidence collection that paralleled and predated my own, spreadsheets tracking fraudulent transactions going back to 1985, audio recordings of conversations with my father where he'd admitted to managing client expectations and optimizing investment outcomes in ways that were clearly illegal, photographs of documents she'd taken covertly over years, and a video file dated 1 week before her death. In the video, my mother sat in her private sitting room, the one I'd loved as a child, wearing the locket that now hung around my neck, and she looked directly into the camera with an expression I'd never seen on her face. Not fear exactly, but resigned determination, the look of someone who knew what was coming and had decided to leave a testimony anyway. "Rebecca," she'd said, my name in her voice after 5 years of silence hitting me like physical impact. "If you're watching this, then I'm probably dead, and your father is probably responsible. I've spent 20 years documenting his crimes, hoping he'd stop, hoping he'd change. But men like William don't change, they just get better at hiding. I've collected everything. The account numbers, the shell companies, the clients he's defrauded, the people he's threatened. It's all here, and I'm leaving it to you because I have to believe, that you're stronger than I was, that you won't let fear keep you silent the way I did for too long." She'd gone on for 17 minutes, explaining the filing system she'd created, the encryption she'd used, the contacts she developed at the SEC and FBI who were sympathetic but couldn't act without solid evidence, and a witness willing to testify. She'd named her friend Linda Morrison, the judge's wife, as someone who knew pieces of the truth, someone who could be trusted if I needed help, someone who'd been urging her to report my father for years. She talked about her regrets, about choosing comfort and security over justice for too long, about hoping I'd never have to make the choices she'd made, but knowing that genetics and circumstance would probably put me in exactly the same position. "I've been weak," she'd said, tears streaming down her face in a video recorded 5 years ago that I was watching in my bathroom at 4 a.m. "But you don't have to be. You're brilliant and brave and everything I should have been. If something happens to me, especially if it looks like an accident, you'll know the truth." He's escalated his threats. He knows I've been collecting evidence. He's asked me multiple times to destroy it, to stop obsessing over the business, to trust him. But I can't trust him, Rebecca. I haven't trusted him in years. So I'm leaving you this message and this evidence and this choice. You can pretend you never found it, live your comfortable life, inherit the empire he built on theft and possibly murder, or you can finish what I started. Either choice will cost you everything. I'm sorry to put this on you. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. I love you more than anything in this world. The video had ended, and I'd sat on my bathroom floor until sunrise, the locket pressed against my chest. My mother's evidence, and my own evidence, and the scope of my father's crimes creating a weight that felt impossible to carry. The choice she described wasn't really a choice at all. How do you know your father is a murderer and thief, and just continue living your life, going to work, pretending everything is normal? But the alternative was terrifying in ways I hadn't fully processed. Reporting him meant destroying our family, losing my inheritance, probably spending years in legal proceedings, becoming the daughter who betrayed her father, marked forever as either a hero or a traitor depending on who was judging. It meant accepting that my entire childhood had been financed by stolen money, that every privilege I'd enjoyed had come from someone else's loss, that my education and opportunities and beautiful life had been built on a foundation of fraud. It meant looking at every memory differently, recontextualizing every moment of paternal pride and love through the lens of knowing what he really was. The locket around my neck felt heavier than silver and gold, felt like it contained the weight of two women's attempts at justice, my mother's abbreviated and mine just beginning. In that bathroom, watching dawn light creep under the door, I'd made a decision that would require destroying everything I'd ever known. I would finish what my mother started, but I wouldn't do it the way she tried. I wouldn't collect evidence while living in his house, wouldn't confront him directly, wouldn't give him the chance to make me another convenient accident. I would disappear. I would die. And from the safety of non-existence, I would bring down his empire piece by piece until there was nothing left but truth and consequences and the justice my mother had died trying to achieve. Planning your own death requires a particular kind of clarity that only comes from absolute desperation, and for 3 weeks after finding my mother's video, I'd researched drowning statistics in Coast Guard response times and Lake Erie's current patterns with the same methodical attention my father applied to fraud, understanding that if this failed, if he discovered I was alive and collecting evidence, I wouldn't get a second chance at disappearing. The plan had to be believable enough that my father would accept it without investigation, public enough that there would be official records and news coverage, but survivable in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious to anyone examining the scene. Lake Erie in October was perfect. Water temperature around 55 degrees, cold enough to kill someone in under an hour but survivable with proper preparation, visibility poor enough that a body search could reasonably fail, weather unpredictable enough that a sudden storm could explain capsizing. I'd bought a small sailboat 3 months earlier, paying cash, registering it under my own name, establishing a pattern of weekend sailing that my father knew about and occasionally commented on with mild concern. "Be careful out there, sweetheart. Those waters are treacherous." The irony of him warning me about dangers while planning to fake my death to escape him felt almost comedic in its darkness. I'd spent weekends practicing capsizing the boat, timing how long it took to sink, understanding the mechanics of making an accident look natural while ensuring I could actually survive it, and each practice run felt like rehearsing a magic trick where the disappearance had to be convincing enough to fool an audience that included my own father, a man who'd successfully made murder look accidental before. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. Those were solvable with research and money and careful planning, but deciding what to take into my new life and what to leave behind in the old one. Rebecca Harper could only carry what Rebecca Miller would reasonably have: some cash, the locket, a waterproof USB drive containing copies of all the evidence, and the clothes I'd wear to my own drowning. Everything else had to stay. My apartment full of furniture I'd carefully chosen, books I'd collected since childhood, photographs that represented 24 years of life, my Yale degree framed on the wall, jewelry my mother had given me, the entire material history of a person who was about to cease existing. The night before, I'd walked through my apartment touching things like I was memorizing them through my fingertips. The kitchen counter where I'd eaten breakfast 1,000 times, the couch where I'd cried after my mother's funeral, the desk where I'd studied for finals and written papers, and more recently, cataloged evidence of my father's crimes. I drafted a note to no one in particular, not a suicide note exactly, but a letter explaining that I needed time alone to think, that I was taking the boat out for a few days, that I needed space from everything, vague enough not to seem suspicious, specific enough that when I disappeared, people would remember I'd been troubled, distant, struggling with something unnamed. The note sat on my kitchen table, anchored by my apartment keys, a tiny staged detail that would help sell the narrative of accident rather than intention. Is survival worth losing yourself? That question haunted me as I'd driven to the marina at dawn, the sky that particular gray that promises rain, wind already picking up in gusts that made the boat rigging clang against metal masts like discordant bells. The marina was mostly empty at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, just a few early fishermen and one elderly man who lived on his yacht year-round, people who'd later tell police they'd seen me launch the boat, that I'd seemed distracted but not suicidal, that the weather had been marginal but not dangerous when I'd left the dock. I'd worn layers, wetsuit under regular clothes, survival gear hidden in waterproof bags I'd attached to buoys I'd already deployed the week before at specific coordinates, everything planned to the smallest detail because failure meant either death or discovery, neither of which I could afford. The boat motor had started with that familiar mechanical cough, and I'd guided the small vessel out into the lake, watching the shore recede, feeling the wind strengthen as I moved away from the protective curve of the harbor. 3 miles out, far enough to be dangerous, but close enough that someone might reasonably attempt sailing in these conditions, I'd cut the motor and begun the choreography of my own disappearance, shredding my identification in cards, dropping them overboard in pieces that would scatter, setting up the distress beacon to malfunction exactly the way equipment does when it gets wet, preparing the boat to capsize in a manner that would look like weather and waves rather than deliberate action. The actual capsizing had been more violent than I'd practiced, the cold water hitting like electricity when I'd gone under, and for 30 seconds I genuinely wondered if I'd miscalculated, if this performance would become real death, if my mother's locket would end up at the bottom of Lake Erie along with her daughter and her dreams of justice. But muscle memory and preparation had taken over, swimming away from the capsized boat, finding the first buoy with my survival gear, changing into the wetsuit properly, starting the timer on my waterproof watch because I had exactly 40 minutes before hypothermia became life-threatening even with proper gear. The swim to the second buoy had taken 12 minutes, each stroke burning in water that felt like knives against exposed skin, and at that buoy I'd found the inflatable kayak I'd hidden the week before, the emergency provisions, the waterproof bag containing everything Rebecca Miller would need: birth certificate, social security card, driver's license, credit cards, all meticulously forged by a document specialist I'd found through contacts my mother had developed, all bearing a face that was mine but a name that was entirely invented. I'd paddled another 2 miles to a small cove where a car waited, purchased cash 3 months ago, registered to a shell corporation, containing clothes and money, and the beginnings of a life that had never existed until I climbed into it soaking wet and shivering so hard my teeth chattered uncontrollably. The heater had blasted as I'd driven away from the lake, away from the marina where Coast Guard boats were probably already launching to search for Rebecca Harper, away from Pittsburgh and my father and everything I'd ever been. By the time I'd reached the motel room in Cleveland I'd rented weeks earlier under my new name, paying cash for a month, my old life was already becoming news. Coast Guard had found the capsized boat, personal effects floating in the water, weather conditions that explained everything. Within hours my father would get the call, would perform grief for cameras, would probably feel some genuine sadness mixed with relief that his problematic daughter, who'd been asking too many questions, was conveniently gone. Within days there would be a funeral for a body they'd never recover, memorial services, obituaries that summarize Rebecca Harper's short life in neat paragraphs that mention Yale and promise and tragedy. And Rebecca Miller would begin the long, quiet work of building a case from beyond the grave, collecting evidence while officially not existing, preparing the testimony that would eventually resurrect her in a federal courtroom. That night, sitting on a motel bed in clothes that still smelled like lake water, holding the locket that had survived 2 women's deaths, I'd looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the face staring back. Same features but different eyes, same body but different identity, same person but fundamentally transformed by the choice to disappear rather than confront, to become a ghost rather than a victim. Living as someone who never existed requires learning yourself backwards, and the first month as Rebecca Miller felt like wearing a skin that didn't fit quite right, constantly aware of the performance, terrified that any moment someone would see through the construction and recognize the dead girl underneath the careful fiction. The Cleveland apartment I'd rented was in a neighborhood called Tremont, 3rd floor walk-up in a building that smelled like curry and cigarette smoke and other people's lives, nothing like the pristine condo I'd owned in Pittsburgh's shady side, and everything about it felt deliberately chosen to be forgettable: beige walls, basic furniture from IKEA, no photographs because Rebecca Miller's fabricated past couldn't be displayed in frames, no artwork because the woman I was pretending to be couldn't have tastes that matched my actual preferences. The first morning I'd woken up there, genuinely woken up, rather than just lying awake counting ceiling tiles, I'd forgotten my new name for 15 seconds, had almost introduced myself to the barista at the coffee shop as Rebecca Harper before catching myself mid-syllable and course-correcting to Miller, the substitution clumsy enough that the barista had given me a strange look and written Becca M. on my cup like she wasn't sure what she'd heard. Those early mistakes were terrifying. Each slip a potential exposure, each moment of forgetting potentially fatal if the wrong person noticed. I'd practiced my new signature hundreds of times until the muscle memory of Rebecca Miller felt almost natural, had rehearsed my fabricated biography until I could recite it without pausing. Born in Boise, Idaho, parents deceased in car accident when I was 19. No siblings, studied paralegal studies at community college, moved to Cleveland for a fresh start after a bad breakup. No social media presence because I valued privacy, ordinary and unremarkable and designed to discourage follow up questions. The job I'd found was intentionally beneath my capabilities. Paralegal at a small firm that specialized in personal injury cases, work that required attention to detail but not brilliance. A position where being quiet and competent meant being invisible, exactly what I needed while I continued my real work after hours. My coworkers were kind in that distant way. People are kind to someone who doesn't share much personal information. Inviting me to happy hours, I'd decline with vague excuses, asking about my weekend plans that I'd answer with lies about visiting friends who didn't exist or catching up on errands that mostly involved reviewing my father's criminal files and building the comprehensive case my mother had started. During lunch breaks, I'd sit alone in a park 2 blocks from the office, eating sandwiches from the same deli every day because Rebecca Miller was the kind of person who valued routine, and I'd watch people living their authentic lives, couples arguing about mundane things, parents chasing toddlers, teenagers laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, and feel the profound isolation of being absent from your own existence. My phone never rang because Rebecca Miller had no friends, no family, no history of connections that would require maintaining. The contacts list contained exactly 3 numbers: my landlord, my employer, and the pizza place that delivered. Sometimes I'd scroll through it late at night, this devastating proof of complete disconnection, and remember when Rebecca Harper's phone had been constantly buzzing with messages and calls and the social currency of being William Harper's daughter. I'd deleted all my social media accounts before disappearing. Not unusual for someone who drowned. Eventually the platforms would memorialize them, but phantom limb syndrome made me reach for my phone to check Instagram or text friends before remembering those friends were mourning my death, that those platforms now contain memorial posts and R.I.P. Rebecca comments from people who'd barely known me but felt entitled to public grief. The loneliness was worse than I'd anticipated, a physical ache that had nothing to do with missing comfort or privilege and everything to do with being severed from human connection at a fundamental level. No one knew me. No one could know me. Every conversation was performance. Every interaction required maintaining character. Every moment of authenticity had to be suppressed because letting someone see the real person underneath the construction meant risking everything. I'd catch myself starting to tell a story from my actual past, about Yale or my mother or some childhood memory, and have to course correct mid-sentence, turning it into something that fit Rebecca Miller's invented history, watching the person I was talking to not quite believe the substitution. 3 months in, a coworker named Jenny had invited me to her birthday party, persistent in that way that kind people are persistent, and I'd gone because refusing repeatedly would have been more memorable than attending, but the whole evening had been torture, people asking normal questions that required abnormal answers, the constant vigilance of maintaining backstory, the performance of being interested in their lives while revealing nothing true about my own. Someone had asked what my parents were like, and I'd said they died when I was young, with no emotion because I'd said it so many times it had become rote. And Jenny had squeezed my arm sympathetically and said that must have been so hard. And I'd almost laughed because yes, my mother's murder had been hard. And yes, being raised by her killer had been hard. And yes, faking my own death to bring him to justice was hard. But none of that was what Jenny was sympathizing with. None of that could ever be shared or understood or validated because I was a ghost pretending to be a person. I'd left the party early, claiming a headache that was actually just the weight of isolation, and walked home through Cleveland streets that felt alien despite living there for months, understanding finally what my mother must have felt during those years of knowing what my father was and being unable to tell anyone, trapped inside knowledge that isolated her from every genuine connection. But the invisibility that made life lonely also made investigation possible, and slowly I'd begun to understand that Rebecca Miller's non-existence was actually power disguised as prison. No one watched me because no one cared about a quiet paralegal in Cleveland. My father believed I was dead, which meant he wasn't monitoring my activity, wasn't tracking my investigations, wasn't anticipating that his daughter was systematically dismantling his empire from the grave. I could request public records without raising flags, could interview former employees and clients under the guise of research for a book about investment fraud, could trace money through jurisdictions without anyone connecting Rebecca Miller to Rebecca Harper. The nights were long and dedicated to work my father had no idea was happening, cross-referencing his ledger with public filings, tracking shell companies through layers of incorporation, building timelines that connected his fraudulent trades to specific client losses, creating the kind of comprehensive documentation that prosecutors dream about and defendants can't defend against. The locket sat on my bedside table while I worked, my mother's photograph visible every time I glanced up from spreadsheets, a reminder that this isolation was chosen rather than inflicted, that being alone was preferable to being complicit, that some kinds of loneliness were worth enduring for the possibility of justice. 4 months into my new life, working past midnight on a Friday while the rest of the building slept, I'd realized that Rebecca Miller wasn't just a disguise or a survival strategy. She was becoming the person Rebecca Harper should have been, someone who valued truth more than comfort, who could endure isolation for principles, who understood that real strength sometimes looked like disappearing rather than fighting, like silence rather than confrontation, like patience rather than immediate action. My mother had tried to bring down my father from inside the marriage, from inside the comfortable life, and it had killed her. I was bringing him down from outside existence itself, from the freedom of being officially dead. And though the loneliness was brutal and the isolation profound, I was still breathing, still building, still moving toward the moment when Rebecca Harper would resurrect in a courtroom and speak the truth that 2 women had died trying to tell. 18 months into being dead, I'd contacted my first victim of my father's fraud through a carefully worded letter sent to an address I'd found in his files, introducing myself as a financial researcher investigating patterns in investment advisor misconduct, offering anonymity, and asking if they'd be willing to share their experience with Harper Investment Group. Eleanor Brennan was 73 years old, living in a modest apartment in Erie after losing her retirement savings to my father's schemes, and when she'd agreed to meet me at a coffee shop halfway between Cleveland and her home, I'd spent the entire drive rehearsing how to extract information without revealing who I really was, how to bear witness to the damage my father had caused without breaking down, and confessing that his blood ran through my veins. The coffee shop had been one of those chain establishments that looked identical everywhere, neutral territory that smelled like burned espresso and cinnamon, and Eleanor had arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a folder of documents like they were evidence at a trial that had never happened. She'd been one of my mother's friends, someone who'd sent me birthday cards throughout childhood, and sitting across from her while she didn't recognize me. My hair different, my weight lower, my entire energy changed by living as someone else, felt like a specific kind of torture that I'd chosen and therefore had to endure. "I trusted William Harper completely," she'd said, spreading out account statements that showed her modest savings systematically depleted over 5 years, tears forming in eyes that looked exhausted by grief that had nothing to do with her husband's death and everything to do with financial devastation. He came to my husband's funeral, held my hand, promised he'd take care of me the way Frank would have wanted, and then he stole everything. My retirement, my emergency fund, the money I'd saved to leave my grandchildren. Gone. And when I tried to get answers, his lawyer sent me letters threatening legal action if I made defamatory claims. I was too scared and too broke to fight back. Her story was the first of 37 I'd collected over 3 years, each interview a descent into the human cost of financial fraud, each conversation revealing not just stolen money but destroyed lives, deferred medical treatments, canceled retirements, families torn apart by arguments about who was responsible for trusting the charming investment advisor. Robert Chen, whose family had lost their restaurant after my father convinced them to invest in a guaranteed return scheme that existed only on paper, had met me in a public library in Youngstown, speaking in whispers because the shame of being defrauded had made him paranoid about public exposure. "Your father, I mean Harper," he'd caught himself, not knowing that his correction was more accurate than his original phrasing. He came to our grand opening, made a toast, told everyone what a smart investment we were making. Then he diverted our capital into shell companies and sent us statements showing growth while the actual money disappeared into offshore accounts. By the time we figured out something was wrong, there was nothing left to recover. The library had been quiet except for the sound of pages turning and keyboards clicking, and I'd recorded his testimony on a device hidden in my purse, adding it to the growing archive of voices speaking truth that my father had tried to silence through legal threats and intimidation and the simple calculation that most victims couldn't afford to fight back against someone with his resources. Each interview had required different approaches. Some people needed empathy and patience, others needed anger validation. A few required seeing proof that I had legitimate evidence before they'd risk speaking, but eventually they'd all shared their stories, contributed their documentation, added pieces to a puzzle that was forming a picture of systematic, premeditated fraud spanning 3 decades. The investigation had required skills I developed partly through my Yale economics degree and partly through necessity, learning to trace money through corporate structures, understanding how offshore banking worked, developing sources inside regulatory agencies who were sympathetic to fraud victims but constrained by evidentiary requirements and prosecutorial discretion. Public libraries became my office, their free computers and anonymous internet access allowing me to research without creating digital footprints that could be traced back to Rebecca Miller or, worse, somehow connected to the supposedly dead Rebecca Harper. I'd learned to use archives and PACER and FOIA requests to pull court documents and regulatory filings, cross-referencing my father's statements against actual transaction records, finding the gaps where money disappeared into structures designed specifically to obscure ownership and movement. Coffee shops provided meeting spaces that were public enough to feel safe, but anonymous enough not to create memorable encounters, and I'd cycled through dozens of them across Northeast Ohio, never meeting the same person in the same location twice, always paying cash, never leaving records that someone investigating the investigation could follow. The work was meticulous and slow, requiring the kind of patience I'd never needed before, understanding that building a case prosecutors couldn't ignore meant documenting every transaction, every victim, every lie with enough redundancy and cross-verification that defense attorneys would find nothing to challenge. My apartment had gradually filled with file boxes, not in plain sight but hidden in closets and under furniture, organized with the same obsessive system my mother had used, each box labeled with dates and client names and types of fraud, creating a physical archive of crimes that existed nowhere in official records because my father had been so careful to structure everything to avoid detection. 3 years into the project, my documentation exceeded what my mother had collected in 20 years of marriage, partly because I had her foundation to build on, and partly because digital forensics had improved dramatically, allowing me to extract information from the hard drives I'd stolen from my father's safe, recovering deleted files and emails he thought were permanently erased. One particularly devastating discovery had been a spreadsheet he'd maintained titled Exposure Risk Assessment, ranking clients by how likely they were to report fraud and how much damage their testimony could cause, with corresponding strategies for each risk level, legal threats for some, financial settlements for others, and in 3 cases, including my mother's, the notation permanent mitigation required. Permanent mitigation. The euphemism for murder rendered in Arial font and color-coded cells, clinical and businesslike, treating assassination as just another risk management strategy. That spreadsheet alone would be damning in court, but I'd learned from my mother's failed attempt that evidence without testimony wasn't enough, that prosecutors needed a witness who could walk them through the documentation, explain the schemes, withstand cross-examination, and do it all with enough credibility that juries would believe them. For 3 years, I'd wondered who that witness would be, whether any of the victims I'd interviewed would be willing to face my father in court, whether I could find someone inside his organization brave enough or angry enough to turn against him. The answer had come gradually, reluctantly, through the accumulation of all these interviews and documents and recordings. The only witness credible enough and comprehensive enough to bring down William Harper was his daughter, the woman whose death he'd probably celebrated as eliminating a threat, the ghost who'd spent years building the case her mother had died trying to complete. Which meant Rebecca Harper would have to resurrect, would have to walk back into existence and face not just her father but public scrutiny and defense attorneys and the complicated question of why she'd faked her death instead of going to authorities immediately, why she'd let him continue operating for 5 years while she built her case, why she'd chosen this dramatic path instead of simpler options that would have involved less pain and isolation. Those questions haunted me as I'd continued working. knowing that eventually I'd have to answer them under oath, that my choices would be examined and judged and possibly used to discredit the evidence I'd spent years collecting, but understanding that the alternative, staying dead, letting my father continue stealing and possibly killing, allowing my mother's murder to remain unsolved, was unacceptable in ways that made personal consequences irrelevant. The knock on my apartment door at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 4 years and 11 months after I drowned in Lake Erie, was so unexpected that I'd frozen with my coffee mug halfway to my lips, paralyzed by the immediate certainty that something fundamental was about to change, and I had approximately 5 seconds to decide how to respond. No one knocked on my door. The mailman left packages in the hallway. My landlord texted before visiting. Co-workers had never been invited over, and Rebecca Miller's carefully constructed non-existence didn't include the kind of social life that produced surprise visitors. Through the peephole I could see a woman in her mid-40s, professional in that specific way that screamed law enforcement or attorney, holding a leather briefcase, and wearing an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and implacable, and before she'd even shown me her credentials, some instinct told me this was about my father, about the case, about the resurrection I'd been simultaneously planning and avoiding for 5 years. "Rebecca Miller," she'd said when I'd opened the door with the chain still attached, her voice carrying just enough emphasis on my fake name to communicate that she knew it was fake. "My name is Diana Reeves. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Justice Department's Financial Crimes Division. I'd like to talk to you about your father. Or should I say, I'd like to talk to Rebecca Harper about William Harper." The world had tilted slightly, that physical sensation of reality shifting that comes with having your deepest secret exposed by someone who shouldn't know it existed, and I'd stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 seconds, calculating whether to slam the door and run or invite her in and face whatever consequences were coming, before deciding that you don't run from federal prosecutors unless you're planning to spend the rest of your life actually being the fugitive you'd only been pretending to be. Diana Reeves had settled into my cheap IKEA couch like she was presiding over a courtroom, arranging documents on my coffee table with the precision of someone building a case, even in casual conversation, and the first thing she'd done was show me photographs that made my blood freeze. Surveillance photos of me conducting interviews with my father's victims, time-stamped and location-tagged. Proof that someone had been watching me watching them, documenting my investigation the way I'd been documenting crimes. "We've been aware of your activities for approximately 18 months, she'd said, her tone neither accusatory nor approving, just factual. "Initially, we thought Rebecca Miller might be an investigative journalist, or perhaps someone working for a plaintiff's attorney building a civil case. But when we started pulling your background and found it was entirely fabricated, very well fabricated, I'll admit, whoever did your documents knew what they were doing, we realized we had something more interesting." It took another 6 months to connect Rebecca Miller to Rebecca Harper, to understand that you'd faked your death rather impressively, and spent 5 years building what appears to be the most comprehensive fraud case I've seen in 20 years of prosecuting financial crimes. She pulled out my mother's death investigation file then, laying crime scene photos on my table next to my coffee mug that was going cold, and I'd stared at images I'd never seen before. My mother's car being pulled from the river, guardrail analysis showing impact angles, and most devastatingly, a photograph of brake line damage that the original investigator had marked as consistent with impact trauma, but that Diana's expert had reanalyzed as consistent with deliberate tampering prior to accident. "Your mother was murdered," Diana had said, not as a question but as confirmation of what I'd known but never proven, and hearing someone else say it, someone with the authority to do something about it, had broken something inside me that I'd been holding carefully intact for years. "We believe your father hired someone to sabotage her vehicle, stage it as weather-related accident, and has successfully evaded responsibility for nearly a decade. We also believe he's defrauded over 200 clients of approximately $400 million, that he's operated a sophisticated Ponzi-adjacent scheme for over 30 years, and that he's possibly responsible for at least 2 other deaths besides your mother's, people who got too close to discovering the fraud. What we don't have is enough evidence to guarantee conviction. Defense attorneys are very good at creating reasonable doubt, at attacking witnesses, at finding procedural errors that get cases dismissed. But you," she pointed at me with a pen, the gesture almost accusatory, You have 5 years of documentation, victim testimony, your mother's evidence, stolen files from his personal safe, offshore account details, and most importantly, you have the credibility of being William Harper's daughter who died and came back specifically to testify against him. That's compelling narrative, Rebecca. That's the kind of testimony that juries remember and judges take seriously. That's the kind of witness that defense attorneys can't destroy because your motivation is too pure. You're not after his money. You already gave that up by disappearing. You're not seeking revenge for being mistreated. He was by all accounts a loving father. You're simply seeking justice for your mother and his victims. That's a powerful story. Justice or revenge? That question had been haunting me since I had first discovered my father's crimes, and sitting across from Diana Reeves while she laid out the federal government's interest in my testimony, I'd finally forced myself to examine my true motivations with the kind of honesty that 5 years of isolation had prepared me for. Did I want my father imprisoned because it was right, or because he'd killed my mother and destroyed my life and forced me to become someone else? Could I separate righteous prosecution from personal vengeance? Did it even matter if the end result was the same, a dangerous criminal facing consequences? Whether my motivations were purely noble or mixed with grief and anger and the complicated love you feel for a parent who's also a monster. Diana had watched me process these questions silently, patient in that way that good prosecutors are patient, understanding that the decision to testify against your own father, to resurrect from the dead and destroy what remains of your family, wasn't something anyone should rush into even when the choice seemed obvious. "I need you to understand what you're agreeing to," she'd finally said, pulling out another document, this one an immunity agreement and witness protection terms. "Testifying means coming back from the dead publicly, which means answering questions about why you faked your death, why you didn't come forward immediately, whether you're complicit in any of his crimes. Defense will attack your credibility, suggest you're an opportunist or mentally unstable or trying to steal your father's money through criminal proceedings rather than inheritance. The trial will take months, maybe years with appeals. Your father will hire the best attorneys money can buy, and they will destroy you on the stand if they can. Your life as Rebecca Miller ends the moment you agree to this, and Rebecca Harper becomes a public figure, probably famous, certainly scrutinized. You'll never have privacy again. You'll always be the daughter who betrayed her father, or the hero who brought down a financial predator, depending on who's describing you, but either way you'll be defined by this choice forever. The rain outside my apartment window had been steady, that autumn rain that feels like it could continue forever, and I'd watched water streak down the glass while considering Diana's offer, thinking about my mother who tried to bring down my father from inside the marriage and died for it, thinking about Eleanor Brennan and Robert Shun and 35 other victims whose stories I'd collected and who deserve someone to speak for them, thinking about the version of myself who drowned in Lake Erie 5 years ago and whether she'd approve of what came next. The locket around my neck felt heavier than usual, my mother's photograph inside it seeming to carry weight beyond silver and paper, and I touched it the way I always did when making difficult decisions, seeking guidance from someone who couldn't answer but whose presence felt tangible anyway. "If I do this," I'd said finally, my voice rough from not speaking much. Rebecca Miller's isolation had made me unused to extended conversations. "I need guarantees that the case is strong enough to win. I'm not resurrecting to watch him walk free on a technicality, or because a jury doesn't understand financial fraud. I'm not becoming public and vulnerable and exposed for nothing." Diana had smiled then, not with happiness but with recognition, the look of someone who'd found exactly the witness she needed. "With your testimony and documentation, this case is as close to guaranteed as federal prosecution gets. Your father is going to prison, Rebecca. The only question is whether you want to be the one who puts him there, or whether you want to stay dead and let someone else maybe, possibly, eventually build a case that might work. You've spent 5 years preparing for this moment. You've sacrificed everything. Your mother died trying to do what you've accomplished. Don't waste that by choosing comfort over closure. And sitting there in my apartment full of evidence boxes and a life that wasn't mine, I'd made the decision that would transform Ghost back into person, victim into witness, daughter into the instrument of her father's destruction. Tell me what you need me to do." Standing in that marble hallway outside Federal Courtroom 3B, moments before resurrection, the locket around my neck had felt like an anchor, or maybe a talisman, and I'd press my palm against it hard enough to leave an imprint in my skin, trying to absorb whatever strength or courage or simply permission my mother might transmit through silver and memory, and the 5 years I'd spent becoming someone else in order to finally become myself again. Diana Reeves stood beside me reviewing final testimony instructions, but her voice had faded into background noise, everything narrowing to the physical sensation of my own heartbeat, and the weight of the choice I was about to make irreversible by walking through those doors and speaking my real name in public for the first time since my funeral. Through the small window in the courtroom door, I could see the back of my father's head, silver hair I'd recognize anywhere, navy suit that probably cost $5,000, posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences and didn't expect to start now. 6 weeks into his federal trial, and he still looked like he was attending a business meeting rather than fighting for his freedom, still performed the role of respectable businessman wrongly accused, still believed his money and lawyers and carefully constructed reputation would save him the way they'd saved him from everything else. He had no idea his dead daughter was about to walk through those doors carrying 5 years of evidence and the testimony of a ghost made flesh. Rebecca Miller, the woman I'd been for 5 years, was about to cease existing in the same way Rebecca Harper had ceased existing in Lake Erie, except this time there would be no coming back, no second constructed identity to hide behind, just the exposure of standing in public view and accepting whatever came from speaking truth that powerful people had tried to bury. The last 5 years have been defined by invisibility, walking through Cleveland as someone nobody noticed, living a life so deliberately unremarkable that coworkers would struggle to describe me if asked, existing in the negative space between observation and memory. Now I was about to become the opposite, the daughter who returned from death, the witness in a federal trial that would dominate news cycles, the person whose face would be analyzed and whose motivations would be questioned, and whose every word would be scrutinized for consistency and credibility. The contrast was so extreme it felt like stepping from darkness into fire, and part of me wanted to turn around, walk back down the hallway, return to the safe anonymity of being Rebecca Miller working her paralegal job and living her quiet isolation. But another part, the part that sounded like my mother's voice on that video, the part that had survived 5 years of loneliness for exactly this purpose, understood that invisible safety was just another kind of death, that silence was complicity, that justice required being seen even when being seen meant being vulnerable to attack. The bailiff inside caught my eye through the window and gave a slight nod. John Mitchum, the one person besides Judge Morrison who knew what was about to happen, security briefed on the possibility that my father might react violently or try to flee when his dead daughter materialized as the prosecution's final witness. Diana squeezed my shoulder once, professional but not unkind, and whispered, "You're doing the right thing," with enough conviction that I almost believed her, almost convinced myself that righteousness would protect against the psychological warfare defense attorneys would wage, that truth would be sufficient armor against the public examination of every choice I'd made. My hand wrapped around the brass door handle, cold despite the building's warmth, worn smooth by thousands of hands that had touched this same spot seeking or fleeing justice, and I thought about all the times I'd touched door handles in my father's house, the mansion where I'd grown up believing in his goodness, the offices where I'd discovered his crimes, the safe that had contained evidence of my mother's murder. This handle was different only in what waited on the other side. Not more secrets, but the public revealing of secrets. Not more hiding, but the end of hiding. Not more preparation, but the moment when preparation transformed into irreversible action. The door opened with that telltale squeak Diana had warned me about, high-pitched and sustained like a movie soundtrack cue, and the first thing that hit me was temperature. The courtroom was cooler than the hallway, aggressively air-conditioned in that way government buildings always are, cold enough that I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms beneath the conservative blue suit Diana had insisted I wear because juries respond to presentation. The second thing was smell, leather from chairs, floor wax, the faint coffee scent from the court reporter's thermos, and underneath it all that indefinable courthouse smell of old wood and document storage and the accumulated tension of 1,000 trials. The third thing was sound, my heels on hardwood floor, 3 sharp clicks before anyone even turned around, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged space like footsteps in a cathedral, each step announcing presence before identity. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, her mouth literally frozen open on a word she'd never complete, And for a moment the entire room existed in suspension, that split second before recognition where everyone knew something significant was happening but hadn't yet processed what. A juror in the front row, middle-aged black woman, who I'd later learn was a schoolteacher named Mrs. Patterson, leaned forward slightly, squinting like maybe her eyes were lying, her expression shifting from casual attention to shocked disbelief in real time. One of my father's attorneys, Marcus Chun, actually dropped his pen, and it clattered against the defense table with a sound that seemed impossibly loud, the kind of noise that draws attention in quiet spaces, that marks moments as significant even before their significance is understood. Judge Morrison's reaction broke me while keeping my face composed, professional training collapsing under personal history in a way that would have been inappropriate from any other judge, but somehow felt right from him. His hand froze halfway to his gavel, suspended in air like time had malfunctioned, and his face did something I'd never seen on a judge's face before, complete unguarded shock, the kind of expression that appears before professional composure can reassert itself. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes went wide and then immediately filled with tears, not falling but definitely there, wet and shining and visible even from across the courtroom. His lips formed my name, Rebecca, but no sound came out initially, his mouth moving silently like his brain, and vocal cords had temporarily disconnected. When he finally spoke, the courtroom microphone caught it and amplified it. "It can't be. She's supposed to be dead." Those words, whispered but broadcast, seemed to unlock everyone else's reactions simultaneously. A defense attorney stood up without appearing to remember standing, his chair rolling backward into the wooden barrier behind him. Two jurors exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations in a look. A court reporter's fingers froze above her stenography machine, and in the gallery behind the wooden divider, spectators began murmuring, the sound building from silence to buzzing confusion to actual noise that the bailiff would have to quiet. But none of those reactions mattered compared to my father's, and he turned last, moving with that careful precision people use when they sense danger behind them but are trying to maintain composure, when they know what's behind them will be terrible but can't stop themselves from looking. His head rotated slowly, shoulder first, and then neck, the movement almost mechanical, and when our eyes met across 30 feet of expensive carpet and institutional furniture, I watched him see me and not believe it, and then believe it and not understand it, and then understand it and realize in one cascading moment of recognition that everything was over. His face didn't just change expression. It collapsed, features literally rearranging themselves from confident to confused to horrified in the space of 3 seconds. Color drained from his cheeks, leaving skin that looked gray under fluorescent lights. His mouth opened but no sound emerged, and I watched his hands grip the edge of the defense table like he needed physical support to remain upright. This was the man who'd comforted me after nightmares, who'd taught me to swim, who'd attended every school play and saved every drawing, and he was also the man who'd murdered my mother and stolen from vulnerable people and made me disappear from my own life in order to survive his love. Looking at him looking at me, I felt everything simultaneously. Grief for the father I'd thought he was, rage for the monster he actually was, vindication that my 5 years hadn't been wasted, and underneath it all, a profound sadness that this was necessary, that families could fracture this completely, that justice sometimes required destroying the person who made you. Diana's voice cut through the frozen tableau with perfect prosecutorial timing, professional and clear despite the chaos she'd orchestrated. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls its final witness, Rebecca Harper." My name, my real name, echoing through the courtroom after 5 years of silence felt like resurrection and execution simultaneously, the official acknowledgement that I was alive, and that being alive meant testifying against my father, that survival had required transformation into witness, that love and justice were sometimes incompatible in ways that broke everyone involved. I walked toward the witness, stand on legs that felt simultaneously steady and about to collapse, aware of every eye tracking my movement, conscious of my father's stare burning into my profile, feeling the locket against my sternum with each step like my mother was walking with me toward the moment she died trying to achieve. William Harper's first attempt to speak produced no sound, just his mouth opening and closing like someone drowning in air, and watching him struggle for words. This man who'd made a career of persuasive speech, who could sell investment schemes to skeptical millionaires, who talked his way out of suspicion for 3 decades, felt like witnessing the collapse of a carefully maintained illusion in real time. His lead attorney, Marcus Chun, had immediately leaned over to whisper something urgent, probably legal advice about maintaining composure or not speaking, or letting the lawyers handle this catastrophic development. But by acknowledging Marcus's existence, his entire focus locked on me with an intensity that felt physical even across the courtroom distance. "Rebecca," he finally managed, my name coming out strangled and desperate, and I watched his hands grip the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles went white, watched his expensive suit stretch across shoulders that were suddenly trembling, watched 5 years of grief he'd performed publicly become something else entirely, maybe genuine shock, maybe rage at being outsmarted, maybe the horrified recognition that his dead daughter had become his destroyer. The courtroom had gone silent in that particular way, that large spaces go silent when everyone is holding their breath simultaneously, waiting to see what happens when the impossible becomes real, when death reverses itself in the middle of a federal trial. Judge Morrison had recovered enough professional composure to bang his gavel once, the sound sharp and authoritative, cutting through the murmuring that had started in the gallery. "Order! This court will maintain order." But his voice carried an edge of emotion that judges aren't supposed to display, and when he looked at me approaching the witness stand, his expression had been complicated, relief that I was alive, mixed with something that looked like apology, maybe for not investigating my mother's death more thoroughly, maybe for not recognizing that the Harper family contained secrets that should have been exposed years ago. The bailiff had positioned himself strategically between my father and the witness stand, subtle but clear positioning that communicated readiness to intervene if William Harper decided that stopping his daughter's testimony was worth whatever consequences came from courtroom violence. My father noticed this positioning, and something in his face shifted from shock toward calculation, the businessman's instinct for assessing situations and determining optimal responses. But before he could fully transition into strategic mode, his own body betrayed him. His legs appeared to give out slightly, requiring him to sit down hard in his chair, the leather creaking under sudden weight, his breathing audible enough that the closest jurors glanced at each other with concern. The defense table erupted into whispered chaos as I reached the witness stand and placed my hand on the Bible the bailiff offered, Marcus Chen frantically flipping through documents like he might find some procedural objection that could undo resurrection. Another attorney typing urgently on a laptop, probably researching whether dead people could legally testify or whether faking death created some kind of credibility issue they could exploit. My father wasn't participating in their panic, wasn't conferring with his legal team or developing strategy, just staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not the indulgent pride of my childhood, not the confident authority of the businessman, not even the cold calculation I'd glimpsed in moments when his mask had slipped, but something raw and unprocessed that might have been genuine emotion if he was still capable of those. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked, the standard oath taking on weight it didn't usually carry when the person swearing it had spent 5 years as a ghost collecting evidence against her own father. "I do," I'd said, my voice steady despite everything. And those 2 words felt like they contained multitudes. "I do swear to tell the truth. I do understand what this costs. I do choose justice over family. I do accept that this makes me either hero or traitor depending on perspective. I do recognize that this moment ends one version of my life and begins another that I can't control or predict." Sitting in the witness box, elevated slightly above the courtroom floor, I had an unobstructed view of my father's continuing collapse, and it was brutal to watch in ways I hadn't anticipated. Part of me had expected him to maintain composure, to perform confidence, to treat this like just another business challenge requiring careful navigation, but instead he looked genuinely shattered, aged 10 years and 10 minutes, the careful construction of William Harper's successful businessman crumbling, to reveal something vulnerable and almost pathetic underneath. Marcus Chun was leaning close again, speaking rapidly into my father's ear, but my father kept shaking his head slightly, dismissing whatever legal strategy was being proposed, his eyes never leaving my face like he was trying to understand through visual intensity how his daughter had transformed from corpse to prosecutor's witness. Diana Rees approached the witness stand with her expression that managed to be both sympathetic toward me and merciless toward my father, understanding that what came next would be devastating for everyone involved but necessary for justice, that sometimes love and law were incompatible in ways that required choosing between them. "Miss Harper," she began, using my real name with emphasis that made it clear to the jury that identity mattered here, that the person testifying wasn't some stranger but someone with intimate knowledge of the defendant. "Thank you for having the courage to be here today. I know this is difficult. Before we discuss your father's crimes, I need to ask you about something that I'm sure the jury is wondering. You've been legally dead for 5 years. Can you explain to this court why you faked your death and what you've been doing for the past 5 years?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I looked directly at my father while answering, needing him to understand that everything that came next was his creation, his responsibility, the inevitable result of choices he'd made decades before I was born. "I faked my death because I discovered my father was a criminal, and I believed, correctly as it turned out, that if I tried to expose him while alive, I would end up actually dead like my mother did." The courtroom erupted at that, gasps and whispers, and one juror actually saying, "Oh my God," loud enough to be heard. But I kept talking, kept my eyes locked on my father's face, watching him hear his daughter publicly accuse him of murder. "For 5 years I've been living under an assumed identity, working as a paralegal in Cleveland, and systematically investigating my father's financial crimes and my mother's death. I collected testimony from 37 victims, traced over $400 million in stolen funds, and documented evidence of fraud spanning 30 years. I stayed dead because being dead kept me safe. And I'm here now because my mother tried to expose these crimes from inside her marriage and it got her killed. So I did it from outside existence itself, from the one place my father couldn't threaten or manipulate or silence me, from the grave he thought I was in." My father's face had gone through several transformations during this explanation, shock giving way to something that looked like betrayal, as if I was the one who'd violated family loyalty rather than him being the one who'd murdered my mother and forced me into exile, as if my survival and testimony were somehow worse than his decades of theft and murder. "Rebecca," he said suddenly, interrupting Diana's next question, his voice loud enough to echo in the courtroom despite not quite shouting, and Judge Morrison immediately gavelled for silence, but my father kept talking, words tumbling out without strategic planning or legal advice, just raw reaction to having his dead daughter materialize as his accuser. "Rebecca, sweetheart, what are you doing? What lies have they told you? What have they promised you? This is insane. You're my daughter, we're family, you can't possibly believe." Marcus Chun had his hand on my father's arm trying to physically stop him from speaking, and Judge Morrison was banging his gavel repeatedly now, warning about contempt, but my father was beyond caring about legal consequences. His carefully maintained composure completely shattered by the resurrection of his supposedly dead child and the realization that she'd spent 5 years building the case that would destroy him. "You faked your death? You let me think you were dead? You let me grieve? For 5 years?" The questions came out twisted with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Was it hurt that I'd deceived him? Or rage that I'd outsmarted him? Or fear that I'd collected evidence he couldn't defend against? Probably all three, complicated by the genuine love he'd felt for me existing somehow alongside his willingness to commit murder and fraud and all the other crimes that made this confrontation necessary. "Mr. Harper, you will be silent or you will be removed from this courtroom," Judge Morrison said with steel in his voice that made clear this wasn't an empty threat. And finally, my father subsided, sinking back into his chair with his hands covering his face, shoulders shaking in what might have been sobs, or might have been rage, or might have been the physical manifestation of understanding that his empire was over, his freedom was ending, and his daughter, his brilliant daughter who he'd underestimated the same way he'd underestimated her mother, was the instrument of his destruction. Diana turned back to me with an expression that asked silently if I was okay to continue, and I'd nodded, steadying myself with a deep breath, touching the locket through my suit jacket, feeling my mother's presence as much as memory allowed. "Let's talk about what you discovered," Diana said, her voice gentler now. "Let's talk about your mother's death and the evidence you found that it wasn't an accident." The testimony lasted 6 hours across 2 days, and by the end, the jury had heard things that would haunt them for years. Not just the clinical details of financial fraud, but the human cost rendered in stories and numbers, and the voice of a daughter who'd sacrificed her own existence to document her father's crimes with a thoroughness that felt both necessary and devastating. Diana had walked me through it chronologically, starting with my mother's investigation that I discovered in the archives, her memos documenting concerns about accounting irregularities that were actually systematic theft, her recordings of conversations where my father had admitted to managing client expectations through fabricated statements and fictitious losses. Playing those recordings in court, hearing my mother's voice for the first time in a decade, professional and careful, but with an undercurrent of fear she couldn't quite hide, had broken something inside me that I'd been holding together through sheer will, and I'd had to pause testimony to compose myself while the jury watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to horror to that particular kind of anger that comes from watching someone abuse trust. My mother's voice had filled the courtroom asking, "William, how do you explain the Cayman account transactions that exactly mirror the losses in the Morrison portfolio?" And my father's voice, younger but recognizable, responding, "Darling, you don't understand sophisticated investment strategies. That's why you focus on family, and I focus on business." The condescension so thick it was almost physically present. The dismissiveness that had probably characterized their entire marriage once she'd started asking questions he didn't want answered. Then came the hard drives I'd stolen from his safe, and Diana had projected documents onto screens for the jury to see. The handwritten ledger spanning 30 years with entries in my father's precise script documenting every fraudulent transaction like he was keeping score in a game only he knew he was playing. The insurance folder with life insurance policies on 7 people, including my mother. The private investigator reports tracking her movements in the weeks before her death, and most damning, that note in his handwriting that I'd read in his office 5 years ago and memorized word for word. Problem requires permanent solution. Contact M for automotive solution. Arrange for bad weather window. Natural accident scenario preferred. The jury had stared at those words projected larger than life on the courtroom screen, and I'd watched them process what automotive solution meant, watched their faces shift from confused to comprehending to horrified as they understood they were looking at a murder order rendered in businessman's euphemism, casual and clinical and terrifying in its bureaucratic brevity. Diana had then presented the reanalysis of my mother's accident, the brake line damage that original investigators had marked as impact trauma, but that forensic experts had now identified as pre-existing damage consistent with deliberate sabotage, photographs showing cut marks that didn't match collision patterns, testimony from a mechanic who'd been paid $50,000 to tamper with the vehicle and had finally agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. My father had closed his eyes during this portion, unable or unwilling to watch his daughter methodically dismantle the narrative of accident and replace it with evidence of premeditated murder, and I'd felt simultaneously powerful and hollow, vindicated and destroyed, right and completely broken by being right. The financial crimes took longer to explain because they were more complex, layered schemes that had evolved over 3 decades as my father had gotten better at hiding theft and more confident that he'd never face consequences. Diana and I walked the jury through it step by step. How he'd create fictitious losses in client accounts by executing legitimate trades but recording different transactions on client statements, making it appear that market conditions had caused losses when actually the money had been diverted to offshore entities he controlled through shell companies in Delaware, Cayman Islands, Singapore, jurisdictions chosen specifically for banking secrecy and resistance to U.S. law enforcement. How he'd maintained 2 sets of books, official records that showed struggling portfolios and private ledgers that tracked where the money actually went, funneling hundreds of millions through layers of corporate structures designed to obscure ownership and defeat forensic accounting. How he'd target specific types of victims, elderly clients who trusted him based on decades of relationship, recent widows who were overwhelmed and vulnerable, immigrant families who didn't fully understand American financial systems and relied on his expertise, anyone who wouldn't immediately notice discrepancies or have the resources to fight back if they did notice. I presented 37 victim statements, people I'd interviewed over 3 years, their voices recorded and their losses documented. Eleanor Brennan, who'd lost her entire retirement and now lived in subsidized housing, the Chin family whose restaurant had closed after my father convinced them to invest in guaranteed returns that evaporated, Timothy Walsh, whose daughter's college fund had been stolen, leaving her unable to afford school. Margaret Foster, whose late husband's life insurance payout had been diverted into offshore accounts, leaving her destitute at 78 years old. The jury had listened with increasing anger as each story revealed not just financial loss but demolished lives, postponed medical treatments, canceled retirements, families destroyed by poverty that my father had engineered while appearing at charity galas and receiving community service awards. The scope of the fraud was staggering when presented comprehensively. Over 200 victims spanning 30 years, approximately $400 million stolen through mechanisms so sophisticated they defeated detection for decades, a pattern of behavior so consistent and calculating it couldn't possibly be explained as mistakes or mismanagement or anything other than deliberate systematic theft. Diana had created a visual timeline projected on the courtroom screens, each victim represented by a line showing when they'd invested and when their money had disappeared, and the cumulative effect was devastating. Hundreds of lines all ending in loss, all connecting back to my father, all representing real people whose trust had been weaponized against them. "Ms. Harper," Diana had asked during direct examination, "in your professional opinion, as someone with a degree in economics from Yale, someone who worked in your father's firm, someone who spent 5 years investigating these transactions, are these the actions of someone who made honest mistakes or someone who deliberately defrauded his clients?" I'd looked at my father then, really looked at him, trying to find some remnant of the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and attended my piano recitals. But all I could see was the criminal who'd killed my mother and stolen from vulnerable people and forced me to fake my own death to survive his love. "These are deliberate crimes," I'd answered, my voice steady despite the emotional devastation of saying these words about my own father. "Every transaction was carefully planned, every theft was methodically executed, every victim was specifically chosen. This wasn't incompetence or bad judgment. This was a 30-year criminal enterprise disguised as investment management." Cross-examination had been brutal but ultimately ineffective. Defense attorneys trying to attack my credibility by questioning why I'd faked my death instead of going to authorities immediately, suggesting I was mentally unstable or seeking attention or trying to steal my father's money through criminal proceedings rather than inheritance, insinuating that my testimony was revenge for some childhood grievance rather than legitimate evidence of actual crimes. Marcus Chin had spent 4 hours trying to make me cry or contradict myself or admit to some ulterior motive, but 5 years of living as someone else had taught me patience and composure in ways my privileged childhood never had, and I'd answered every question calmly, referred to documentation when challenged, maintained consistency even when he tried to confuse timelines or question my memory. "Isn't it true, Ms. Harper, that you're angry at your father?" he'd asked at one point, voice dripping with insinuation. "Yes," I'd answered simply. "I'm angry that he murdered my mother. I'm angry that he stole from vulnerable people. I'm angry that he made me disappear from my own life to survive him. But anger doesn't make evidence false. The documents are real. The victims are real. The crimes are real. My emotions don't change facts." The jury had nodded slightly at this, and I'd seen Marcus Chen realize that attacking my credibility was actually reinforcing it, that every attempt to paint me as vindictive daughter just reminded jurors that I'd sacrificed everything to testify, that I had no financial motive because I'd already given up my inheritance by disappearing, that my only possible motivation was the one I'd stated: justice for my mother and his victims. The jury had deliberated for 11 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 47 counts: fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. And when the foreman had read those words, my father had closed his eyes like someone accepting a death sentence, which in many ways it was, at 68 years old, facing federal guidelines that mandated at least 25 years. He would almost certainly die in prison. Judge Morrison had set sentencing for 6 weeks later, and during that time I'd existed in a strange liminal space between relief and grief, vindicated but not victorious, right but not satisfied in the way I'd imagined being right would feel. The news coverage had been intense and invasive. Reporters camped outside my new apartment in Pittsburgh where witness protection had relocated me, endless analysis of the daughter who returned from death, think pieces about family loyalty versus moral obligation, speculation about my mental state and motivations, and whether I was hero or traitor or something more complicated than those binary options allowed. Diana had warned me this would happen, that public trials meant public judgment, but knowing intellectually that strangers would have opinions about your choices was different from actually reading comments online calling you brave or calling you a monster, sometimes in the same thread, sometimes by the same people who couldn't decide which narrative fit better. 3 weeks after the verdict, I'd gotten a letter from my father, handwritten on prison stationery, his once precise penmanship shakier but still recognizable, asking if I would visit him before sentencing, saying he needed to talk to me, that there were things he wanted to say that couldn't be said through lawyers or in courtroom proceedings surrounded by observers and official transcripts. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let silence be the final word between us, to maintain the distance that had kept me safe for 5 years and that felt necessary even now that he was locked behind bars where he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. But another part, the part that was still his daughter despite everything, the part that remembered being 8 years old and believing he was the best person in the world, needed to hear whatever he wanted to say, needed some kind of closure, even if closure wasn't really possible when the person you're closing things with is both your father and your mother's murderer. The visitation room at the Federal Detention Center was exactly as depressing as expected, gray walls and fluorescent lighting and plexiglass barriers between inmates and visitors, phones that crackled with static, metal stools bolted to the floor, everything designed to remind everyone involved that this was punishment rather than social call. My father had looked diminished in Prison Orange, thinner after 3 weeks of institutional food and stress, his silver hair unwashed and his face carrying lines that seemed to have appeared overnight, aging visible and dramatic in ways that would have been gradual under normal circumstances. We'd sat across from each other separated by plexiglass and connected by phones, and for several minutes neither of us had spoken, just looked at each other like we were meeting for the first time, trying to reconcile the people we'd been to each other with the people we'd become through choices and consequences, and the collision of love with justice. "I don't expect forgiveness," he'd finally said, voice rough through the phone connection, and I'd appreciated that he didn't open with apology or justification or any of the defensive tactics I'd anticipated. "I don't expect you to suddenly decide that what I did was acceptable or that your testimony was wrong. You did what you had to do. What your mother tried to do and couldn't finish because He'd stopped there, unable or unwilling to say the words, but we both knew what came next. "Because I killed her. But I need you to understand something that doesn't excuse anything but might explain something. I loved you both. Your mother and you. That wasn't performance. That wasn't strategy. The man who held you when you were born and taught you to swim and cried at your graduation, that was real. And the man who killed his wife and stole from vulnerable people and made you fake your death to survive, that was also real. Both versions existed in the same person, and I don't know when or how the second one became more powerful than the first, but acknowledging that doesn't make the crimes less terrible. It just makes them more tragic. Something about his honesty, not asking for anything, not defending himself, just stating the complicated truth that people can be multiple contradictory things simultaneously, had loosened something in my chest that I'd been holding rigid for 5 years. "You taught me right from wrong," I'd said, my voice shaking slightly despite attempts at control. "You taught me to stand up for people who couldn't defend themselves, to value integrity over comfort, to believe that actions had consequences. You taught me everything I needed to become the person who would bring you down. That's the irony that I've been living with. I learned justice from you, and then I had to use those lessons against you. Every value you instilled in me as a child, I deployed as an adult to destroy you. And I don't know if that makes me your greatest success or your biggest failure, if you'd be proud or devastated that I became exactly what you taught me to be, just aimed in your direction instead of the direction you'd intended." My father had smiled then, sad and genuine, the expression of someone recognizing truth, even when truth was painful. "Both," he'd said simply. "I'm both. Proud that you had the courage to do what was right despite the cost, devastated that doing what was right meant destroying me, horrified that I created circumstances where those two things had to be the same. Your mother would be proud of you. She tried to do what you succeeded at doing. She documented and investigated and collected evidence, but she couldn't leave, couldn't walk away from the comfort and the life and the hope that maybe I'd change if she just stayed patient enough. You were stronger. You left. You became dead rather than complicit. That took a kind of courage she didn't quite have, and I mean that as observation, not criticism. The conversation had lasted 90 minutes, neither of us rehashing the crimes or the trial or assigning blame that was already assigned by jury verdict and legal consequences, just two people who'd once been father and daughter trying to understand how they'd ended up on opposite sides of plexiglass with decades of fraud and one murder and 5 years of fake death between them. He'd asked about my plans, and I told him honestly that I didn't have any beyond surviving the next few months, that Rebecca Miller was gone and Rebecca Harper was too public now to just slip back into normal life, that probably I'd write a book or consult for prosecutors or find some way to transform what had happened into something useful, but that mostly I was just trying to figure out who I was when I wasn't investigating my father or living as someone else, when I was just myself without the constructions and performances and survival strategies. Whoever you become, he'd said near the end of visiting hours, don't let what I did define you. Don't let me be the center of your story forever. You're 29 years old. You have decades ahead of you. Use them for something other than avenging your mother or punishing me. Those things are done now. What comes next should be yours, not determined by my crimes or your response to them. It was surprisingly generous advice from someone facing life in prison, and I'd nodded, not quite able to speak around the lump in my throat, understanding that this was probably the last meaningful conversation we'd ever have, that sentencing would be procedural, and visits afterward would be constrained by prison regulations and the awkwardness of having nothing left to say. Walking out of the detention center into weak February sunlight, I'd realized that the lesson wasn't singular or simple, that there wasn't one moral to extract from 5 years of being dead and 1 day of resurrection, and a trial that had exposed everything while resolving nothing emotionally. The lesson was multiple and contradictory, and deeply uncomfortable, that people you love can be monsters, that justice sometimes requires destroying family, that truth comes with costs that aren't always worth paying but must be paid anyway because the alternative is complicity in horror. That my father had taught me right from wrong, and then been living proof that knowing the difference didn't mean choosing correctly, that intelligence and love and moral instruction weren't sufficient defense against ambition and greed and the seductive belief that rules apply to other people but not to you. That my mother had tried to be strong and failed in ways I'd succeeded, and that didn't make her weak or me better, just differently positioned with different resources and different breaking points. That being right didn't feel triumphant when being right meant testifying against your father, that justice was necessary but not satisfying, that closure was a myth people told themselves to make endings feel more complete than they actually were. And underneath all of it, the recognition that we'd both learned things in this process, my father learning too late that there were consequences even for the powerful, me learning that survival sometimes required becoming unrecognizable to yourself, both of us learning that love and justice could be incompatible in ways that broke everyone involved without clear answers about which one should win when they collided. 6 months after sentencing, my father received 28 years, meaning he'll be 96 if he survives to release, which we both know he won't. I sat in a coffee shop in Pittsburgh's Lawrenceville neighborhood, the same city where I'd grown up but in a part of town my privileged childhood had never included, writing in a journal that my therapist had suggested might help process everything that couldn't be processed through testimony or news interviews or the book deal that publishers kept offering, and I kept declining because I wasn't ready to turn trauma into product quite yet. The locket hung around my neck the way it had every day since my mother's funeral, heavier now with meaning than with silver, containing not just her photograph, but the weight of 2 women's attempts at justice, and the complicated recognition that survival sometimes required choices that destroyed you even while saving you. Outside the window, ordinary life continued in ways that felt both mundane and miraculous after 5 years of living as ghost and 6 months of living as public figure, people walking dogs, couples arguing about nothing, teenagers laughing at jokes only they understood, the basic human activity of existing without performance or strategy or constant vigilance. Part of me envied their normalcy, the privilege of lives not defined by trauma or testimony or having to choose between love and justice, but another part understood that everyone carried invisible histories, that probably some of those ordinary-looking people walking past had their own complicated relationships with truth and family, and the question of when staying silent became complicity in harm. What worth do we overlook in others? That question had been circling my mind since the trial, amplified by the public response to my story, which had divided sharply between people who saw me as heroic and people who saw me as traitor, with very little middle ground for the complicated reality that I was probably both and neither simultaneously. Just someone who'd made choices under impossible circumstances and now had to live with consequences that included fame I didn't want and scrutiny I couldn't escape. But the question wasn't really about me. It was about all the people whose contributions we miss because we're not looking in the right places, all the silent support that goes unacknowledged, all the invisible work that makes visible success possible. My mother had spent 20 years documenting my father's crimes, collecting evidence, building the case that I'd eventually finished, and for most of that time she'd been dismissed as just a housewife, just the pretty woman at charity events, just the quiet presence in the background of my father's success. Her worth, her brilliant legal mind, her courage in documenting crimes while living with a criminal, her foresight in leaving evidence for me to find, had been completely overlooked by everyone, including me, until after her death, until I discovered the micro SD card behind her photograph and understood that she'd been fighting all along, just fighting in ways no one recognized as fighting. How many other people are we failing to see? How many silent warriors are we walking past because their battles don't look like what we expect battles to look like? Eleanor Brennan, the 73-year-old woman who'd been one of my first interviews, had written me a letter last month that I'd read so many times the paper was wearing thin at the folds. "You gave me back something more valuable than money," she'd written in shaky handwriting. "You gave me validation. For 5 years I thought I was stupid for trusting your father, thought I'd been foolish and careless and deserved what happened. When you testified, when you explained that he'd systematically targeted vulnerable people, that it wasn't my fault or my failure but his calculated crime, something shifted inside me. I stopped blaming myself. That's worth more than any financial restitution. Thank you for seeing us, for spending 5 years collecting our stories when you could have just lived your life and let us continue suffering in silence." Her words had broken me in the best way, reminding me that justice wasn't just about punishment or restitution, but about acknowledgement, about saying to victims that their pain mattered and their truth was real and they weren't crazy or stupid or deserving of the harm that had been inflicted on them. My father had stolen their money, but he'd also stolen their sense of reality, convincing them through carefully crafted lies that their losses were their own fault, market conditions, bad luck, anything except his deliberate theft. Restoring their understanding of what had actually happened, that felt like returning something more fundamental than dollars, returning their ability to trust their own perception of reality. The book I wasn't ready to write kept writing itself anyway in journal entries and therapy sessions and long conversations with Diana Reeves, who'd become something close to a friend in the aftermath of the trial, both of us processing the way justice felt different in practice than in theory, how winning a case didn't erase the cost of fighting it, how being right about someone's guilt didn't make you feel good when that someone was your father. "You did something extraordinary," Diana had told me over dinner last week, and I'd laughed bitterly because extraordinary was just another word for traumatic, just a prettier way of describing choices that no one should have to make, sacrifices that destroyed you even while serving good. But she pushed back, insisting that reframing my experience wasn't about minimizing pain, but about recognizing that pain with purpose was different from pain that meant nothing, that my 5 years of isolation had prevented my father from victimizing more people, that my testimony had validated 37 victims and potentially deterred other financial predators who now understood that even the most careful crimes could eventually be exposed. "Impact matters," she'd said, "not as compensation for what you lost, but as evidence that loss wasn't meaningless. You turned your trauma into justice for others. That's not nothing." I wanted to argue, wanted to say that I hadn't chosen trauma so much as had it inflicted on me and then made the best of impossible options, but maybe that was the point. Maybe heroism wasn't about choosing to suffer, but about what you did with suffering that was chosen for you, how you transformed pain into something that reduced other people's pain even incrementally. The locket had become my touchstone for all of this, my mother's photograph inside it, her evidence hidden behind it, the silver warm against my skin from being held during every difficult moment of the past 6 months. Sometimes I wondered what she'd think of how things turned out, whether she'd approve of my choices or criticize my methods, Whether she be proud that I'd finished what she started or devastated that finishing it had required me to disappear for 5 years and then resurrect as public spectacle. Probably she'd feel all of it simultaneously, the way I felt all of it, because complex situations didn't produce simple emotions and love didn't mean agreeing with every choice someone made. But I hoped, she'd recognize that I'd seen her, finally, fully, not just as the mother who'd raised me, but as the woman who'd fought silently for justice and left me the tools to continue fighting when she couldn't anymore. That recognition felt like the real inheritance, more valuable than money or property, or the mansion that now belonged to the government after asset seizure, the inheritance of understanding that worth isn't always visible, that strength doesn't always look strong, that the people we overlook might be the ones fighting hardest in ways we're not equipped to recognize. My mother had taught me that by being overlooked herself, by fighting invisible battles that no one acknowledged until after her death, by proving that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone thinks is powerless. Sitting in that coffee shop, journal open but temporarily abandoned, I'd thought about everyone watching the story unfold through news coverage and trial transcripts and the social media discussions I tried to avoid but couldn't entirely escape. What did I want them to take from this beyond the obvious lessons about financial fraud and family betrayal? Maybe this, that we all carry worth that others don't see, contributions that go unacknowledged, battles that remain invisible until someone takes the time to look closely and recognize what's been there all along. That the person you're overlooking, the quiet coworker, the stay-at-home parent, the daughter who seems to just be living off her father's success, might be fighting wars you can't see, carrying evidence you don't know exists, preparing testimony that will eventually change everything. That worth isn't about visibility or recognition or public acknowledgement, but about integrity and courage and the choices you make when no one's watching and no one will ever give you credit for making them. My mother had worth that no one saw until I found her hidden evidence. I had worth that my father didn't recognize until I walked through courtroom doors he thought I'd never reach. The 37 victims had worth that society overlooked until someone spent 5 years collecting their stories and insisting they mattered. Worth existed independent of acknowledgement, but acknowledgement, truly seeing people, truly recognizing their contributions, truly understanding their battles, that transformed worth from private knowledge into shared validation, from isolated struggle into collective witness. And maybe that was the lesson that justified everything, the meaning that made meaning possible. We owe each other the courtesy of looking closely enough to see what's actually there, of recognizing worth even when it's hidden, of acknowledging battles even when they're fought silently. Because the person you're not seeing might be the one who most needs to be seen, and your failure to look might be the final burden that breaks them, while your willingness to truly see might be the validation that keeps them fighting. If after hearing my story you feel there's someone in your life you haven't truly seen, a parent whose struggles you've dismissed, a sibling whose contributions you've overlooked, a friend whose silent battles you fail to acknowledge,